Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to let some folks roll in and then we'll get started. All right, well, I think we're ready to get started. Hi, everyone. Bonjour. Welcome to today's session on key topics in aligning Canadian electricity systems with net zero. Thank you so much for joining us. Moi, je suis Anna Kenduth et je suis associée de recherche principale à l'Institut canadien pour les choix climatiques. La session se déroulera en anglais avec une traduction en direct en français. Donc, si vous souhaitez écouter la discussion en français, veuillez cliquer sur le bouton d'interprétation en bas de l'écran et sélectionner le français. Now, before I begin, I wanted to start by acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, territory that is now home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And as world leaders meet in Glasgow for COP26, I think it's important for folks in this space to reflect on how Indigenous people around the world continue to face barriers to participation in climate conversation, and whose perspectives and expertise continue to be underrepresented and undervalued. Organizations like ours have a really important role to play in amplifying Indigenous voices and ensuring that our work meaningfully and inclusively embodies Indigenous perspectives. And of course, actions speak much louder than words. So to make sure that we're being good on this commitment, the Institute is doing a number of things. And most recently, it has commissioned a series of Indigenous case studies and essays from Indigenous researchers and knowledge holders to share their insights and perspectives, which you can read on our website. And as part of this electricity project, we've also commissioned a scoping paper by Indigenous Clean Energy, which will explore opportunities to support greater deployment of Indigenous clean energy projects. We also hope to have another webinar in the new year, just like this one today, where we can speak with the authors of that paper about their findings. So we hope to see you there as well. So speaking of scoping papers, we are so pleased to be joined today by the authors of 4 new scoping papers that were commissioned by the Institute to explore key topics in aligning Canadian electricity systems with net zero. So we commissioned these papers to generate new thinking and insights from leading experts in the field, both to support our work on this electricity project, but also to help others unpack complex issues related to electricity system transformation in Canada. So these papers explore the technical pathways to aligning Canadian electricity systems with net zero, opportunities to improve integration and coordination across systems, barriers to innovation, and the role of broader energy system integration as a means to enable decarbonization. And those papers were authored by our guests today. So we have Blake Shaffer, Assistant Professor in the Department of Economics in the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, Pierre-Olivier Pineau, Professor at HEC Montréal and Chair in Energy Sector Management, Sara Hastings-Simon, Assistant Professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy in the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, and Madeleine McPherson, Assistant Professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Victoria. So I'll be sure to drop the link to those scoping papers authored by these folks in the chat, so you can check them out after today's call. And we'll also be recording this session and we'll be posting it to our website. But with that, I'll pass it over to Jason Dion, our Mitigation Research Director at the Institute, who's going to provide a brief overview of our project before launching into a discussion with our guests. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks very much, Anna. So this webinar today, we're going to structure it like a moderated discussion among the authors, and we'll have some time for question and answer at the end. So if questions come up along the way, please drop them in the chat and Anna will be collating those and we can put them to the panelists later on. So before we get into it, I just wanted to quickly explain our larger electricity-focused project here at the Climate Institute. So earlier this year, we came out with some work called Canada's Net Zero Future. And among other things, what that work did is really show that there are safe bets and wildcards, as we called them, on the path to net zero. And those safe bets are things that play a really big role kind of no matter what. And two key ones that came up there were non-emitting electricity and electrification of energy end uses. So what we wanted to do was come back with our next project, really kind of laser focused on that question of, well, how do we deliver on that potential? So our focus here in this work and in this project is going to be on identifying policy that can help drive the transformative change that's going to be needed to align Canadian electricity systems with those net zero goals. Our final report will launch next spring, and we'll also be rolling out some materials on the way, including these scoping papers in this webinar that you're attending here today. So with that bit of background out of the way, I'll invite our other panelists to switch their videos on and we'll get straight into it. So where I'd like us to start is, recognizing that the entire audience may not have yet read your excellent scoping papers. Maybe we can sort of map out the content a bit for them. So try to, as quickly as you can, sort of summarize what the focus of each of your scoping papers was, and maybe what's the one big idea from it that you'd like to put in front of the group. So try to go as quick as we can so we can keep it, get to the other questions, but maybe I'll have Blake kick us off.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jason, and great to be here, and awesome to see so many participants really interested in this space. Wonderful. So my paper starts with what has probably become a cliche, that electricity is a cornerstone of Canada's pathway to net zero. So the scoping paper really tries to look at what can we expect in that future electricity system that goes down that path. I won't spend much time on it because I have a minute, and we're going to spend more time on it today, but basically 5 things come true or that we can expect in great degree of certainty. The first is we're going to need a lot of clean energy, a lot of it. And the bulk of that incremental clean energy is going to come from renewables, wind and solar, simply put, because they're the cheapest form of energy. But of course, as we know, renewables have their challenges in terms of managing their intermittency and variability. So they're going to require 4 complements. And I discussed those 4 in the piece. One is supply side solutions, clean, firm technology. This is where nuclear, expanded hydro capacity, even hydrogen, all these things come into it. The other is transmission. So leveraging the heterogeneity across resources across Canada, our electricity systems are very distinct province to province. So transmission can provide some links. And that might be for some exciting discussion today, given the news in the States. The other is demand side solutions. Leveraging flexibility inherent in consumer demand, something we haven't had to do in the past, so it may seem foreign to folks, but it's going to be increasingly valuable and increasingly relevant. And the last one, before I get the gong, is storage. So we know short duration storage, we've already got good options for that. The long duration, especially seasonal storage, is going to be a challenge for Canada. I'll pass the baton back.
Thanks, Blake. So Sarah, maybe you can tell us about the lens your scoping paper takes.
Sure. So I, in my paper, really look at the non-technical challenges in getting to net zero within our electricity sector. And those are really, I think, very much based around the strong path dependency that there is in the electricity sector. And so in particular, this combination of infrastructure, network effects, and institutions that kind of work to lock us into the system that we have today. And I look at the different ways that these play out and sort of enumerate the challenges and then potential solutions. I think to me, central to that is really what are the goals, mandates, and incentives that regulators and others in the system have. And in particular, regulators in the utility system have a very clear mandate and requirement to deliver reliable electricity up to some defined standard of reliability at least cost. And that really limits what they're able to do around considering carbon. But I think beyond that, there's a number of other elements that we need to tackle. And that includes things like siloed planning, both between provinces, but also within provinces across energy systems. So say between the electricity and gas system, a lack of up-to-date information on the rapidly changing costs and underlying technologies that are key for decarbonization, challenges around market access and the right price signals and metrics that largely come from a time when we were optimizing around different things again within the electricity sector. And then finally, the way that interests in maintaining the status quo play out there. And so looking really at how those changes on the non-technical side can really help us to deploy the technology that we need ultimately to get to net zero.
Thanks, Sarah. So maybe over to Pierre-Olivier next, and I'll add on his behalf that his paper does a really great summary of all of the complexity that exists when you look across all the different markets and regulatory structures in Canada. So if you're looking for a great synthesis of what can be a pretty complex area, it's a great resource. So over to Pierre-Olivier.
Okay, thank you, Jason, for that. So yes, my paper provides a background on what do electricity sectors look like across Canada. And although, you know, we are proud of our diversity, that's the kind of diversity we shouldn't be proud of across Canada in electricity markets. There's too much diversity and it's not conducive to the best solutions. And the kind of problem it creates is that, you know, Blake was mentioning the lack of long-term storage. Well, we have a lot of long-term storage in Canada, but it's not accessible, and it's not, these markets are not designed to make it accessible to other provinces that do not have this long-term storage in terms of dams and reservoirs in hydropower. So Hydro-Quebec, Labrador, Manitoba, BC all have like terawatt hours of long-term storage that could be used for integrating more wind, intermittent wind and solar in their system if there were the adequate market designs and of course interties allowing this kind of storage. So I'm providing basically this background and then also showing the key arguments for more integration, which are well known, and there are lots of papers saying that there should be more collaboration across provinces, and that's very important. And then, you know, I mentioned the economic gains, the environmental gains that would come with more integration. So I go over, and I'll stop very soon, but I'll just go over the key challenges, and then I suggest 4 possible strategies that could be used to foster integration in Canada.
Thanks, Pierre-Olivier. So Madeleine, yours kind of has an even broader scope in a way, as if our scope so far wasn't broad enough. So I wanted to end with you so you can kind of zoom out a little bit on the larger challenge in a way.
Yeah, so my argument really follows a lot on from Pierre-Olivier's, but maybe even taking a step further back is really to, from the broadest sense of energy systems integration, really the argument I'm trying to make in my paper is that we need to start thinking about this broad perspective across a number of different dimensions. So spatially, of course, there, you know, interprovincial transmission lines being a big part of the spatial perspective of, or the spatial broadening of our power systems. But also we're seeing this happening sectorally. So electric vehicles being a really good example where we're seeing the power and transport systems coming together. You know, these two sectors used to depend on fundamentally different fuel carriers, and now they're really converging on electricity. And so what that means from a planning and operational perspective is that we need to be thinking about these two sectors together. So really, it's this broadening of perspective across a number of different dimensions, spatially, sectorally, even temporally, right? As we're thinking about the variability of wind and solar, but then also longer term extreme events through climate change and uncertainty around long-term changes in how our power systems are going to operate. So I think another way of sort of framing this or putting this is that as we come to terms with the critical role that electrification is going to play in our decarbonization pathway, the implication of this is really that the reach of our power system is expanding into a bunch of areas that it maybe played a smaller role in before. And this expanded reach really means that we have to take a more holistic perspective when it comes to thinking about the planning and operation of our power systems. So of course, I come from a modeling perspective, a modeling background. So for me, this is all framed around integrating different models, transport models with building system models, with power system models. But I think that the bigger and larger implications for this are really on the institutional side of things. So new markets that encourage investments that in areas that maybe straddle two different sectors, for example, being a really complicated, difficult one. Convening power system planners with transport system planners and policy analysts who are, as they're developing EV adoption incentives and new regulatory frameworks like the ones that we're seeing, as Blake just mentioned, out of the US, and a lot going on in Europe right now that are enabling sort of these cross-border integrations. So I think that this is important from a technical perspective, but it's also really this institutional piece. How do we get the stakeholders and the people in the room to really to take this broader perspective?
Thanks, Madeleine, and thanks all for those summaries. So I think what I'd like to do now is kind of zoom in on this specific question, and recognizing, we just covered a lot of ground. I'd encourage you to take a look at the scoping papers to learn more, but maybe to sort of extract some of the key learnings for our audience here. I'll start with Blake on this question, since his scoping paper was kind of directly focused on it. And that's really around imagining the future system and what it looks like. So the question is, what can be said with confidence about how future net zero aligned electricity systems will look and work, and what remains uncertain? So in what ways are the challenges ahead of us different from the ones behind us? So over to Blake to start us off.
Sure, I'm going to start with what's uncertain, because that's the easier one. Sure. To me, what's uncertain is what's going to be the incremental clean, firm power in Canada. So we've got a lot of hydropower, but we know there's challenges to building new large hydro. We've seen that in terms of cost overruns and sort of public acceptance of that. Nuclear remains that wild card. Similar issues around public perception, but also costs remain an open question mark on there. So what provides that clean, firm power is one of the uncertainties. It's really, in my view, it's about public attitudes and really comes down to costs as they commercialize. The other big uncertainty is transmission. Like Pierre talked about, anyone who's been in this space for a long time has noted the value of interconnectedness. It's increasingly so as we try to decarbonize. But we just saw today where Quebec and Massachusetts trying to connect a large power line, bring Quebec Hydro down into Massachusetts, blocked by Maine. And this was after it was blocked by New Hampshire. And so there's tremendous challenges with building linear infrastructure in Canada. We know this. There's challenges in this electricity space politically and dealing with incumbents and things like this. On the certainty side, like I said, wind and solar in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, although that might sound surprising, to me, that's a certainty that they're going to grow rapidly. Simply, it's a cost story. I think one of the things is on what Madeleine mentioned, greater integration. We typically think about electricity supply systems as having these exogenous connections to it. So natural gas supply being something that's a different system altogether. The demand being an exogenous thing that's modeled as a vertical line in economics. It's just, it's a number. Increasingly, we're going to have relationships between supply and demand where demand acts more flexibly. Similarly, we'll have co-optimization with whether it's natural gas or other fuel systems. So I think that's something that I see occurring. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Blake. And maybe we can go to Madeleine next, kind of recognizing she's taking a broader perspective on these same topics. So wondering what you might point out that Blake might not have covered so far.
Well, I think that one of the things that I think that we know for sure is that the planning and operation of our power systems is going to look really different from what it is now. And I think, again, there's a number of different dimensions on that, but I think one of the ones that's clearest in my mind is that the metrics that we talk about and remunerate in the power system really have to change. So, the most obvious one that I think we've been talking about for a while is that fuel costs and marginal costs of power system dispatch really lose their relevancy in a world in which, the power system is dominated by renewables that have zero marginal costs, right? Where we're not paying for fuel anymore. So that marginal rate of electricity, the metric around that looks totally different. And instead, what we need and what we need to remunerate is flexibility, right? Being able to deal with the variability and uncertainty of renewables, both on an hourly and daily basis, but also longer term, right? And so this is maybe where another word like adaptability might come in. How do we actually pay for those things that we care about instead, and not pay for the things that, again, are starting to lose their relevancy in this highly renewable, highly electrified world. The second thing I think that is going to look very different, that I would say with confidence, is, again, the people in the room, who is actually doing the planning and operation of the power system, and the different perspectives that need to be in that room, the different types of planners that need to be in that room, the longer, basically an expanded list of stakeholders that really need to be there involved in the planning, maybe not so much the operation, but for sure the planning of these power systems. I think that, as Blake was just saying, the role of interprovincial transmission is still uncertain. I think that, we're all on the same page in terms of the value that it could provide, but whether or not it actually happens, I think is still a question mark. And I think it's an important question mark because I think it could have a lot of downstream effects on things like the type of generation infrastructure. So how much wind we can gets deployed in Alberta and Saskatchewan, for example, I think is a question that in part depends on whether the extent to which we have interprovincial transmission lines. Also where jobs are and to what extent the transition, is just and who those sort of, as Sarah was saying earlier this morning, the winners and losers are, where they are in the country. I think it depends a little bit on that interprovincial transmission line. So I think there's some uncertainty around that, and uncertainty that has a lot of sort of knock-on effects. So that would be where I would say there's certainty and uncertainty.
Yeah. Thanks, Madeleine. So for our next question, I'd like to go to Sara and then Pierre-Olivier. And really, if we would, sort of what we've been talking about so far, imagining the future system, what do we know for sure? What's uncertain? Now I'd like to ask kind of what needs to change given that future system and its needs. So in your mind, are we currently set up to support the changes needed to realize that future? And if not, what kind of policy changes might we need to get us on the right path? Though, even thinking beyond policy, institutions, incentives, markets. So Sara, you cover a lot of this ground in your scoping paper. So why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think in a sense, it's sort of the opposite of all of the barriers that I mentioned when I started out, right? But the one to me that's really, I think, central is this like system level, utility regulator level mandate, right? And so, even utility commissions and corporations and the market operators that want to say reduce their emissions, they're really constrained by this requirement of front and center is a certain amount of reliability at the lowest price. And so in some cases, it's even not clear that they could, if they wanted to, kind of elevate emissions reductions to that level, and certainly they're not required to. So I think starting from this idea of similar to how we don't tell utilities or system operators we want all of the reliability, you have to give them some sort of target to head towards and then optimize price around that. I think we need to do something similar within the emission space, which is, set these targets for where we're going to get to with our electricity sector. And then the optimization becomes, you have to hit this reliability level, this emissions level, and then you go and optimize your system for the price. And so I think that's front and center and important. Coming after that, there are then some of the things that Madeleine was mentioning around integrated planning and really the stakeholders and, especially the degree to which we're starting to electrify things that we might, for example, be using the natural gas system for today. There isn't really a great existing way for those groups to work together in the planning process, and that is going to be important. Similarly, I think the information and data sharing is something that really needs to improve. And that is particularly challenging, as I said, in this field where, things are moving quickly. If you have in your head the price benchmark of renewables or storage from 6 months or even a year ago, that's probably wildly out of date now. And that's not something that is, that's something that's totally new. So again, similar to what Madeleine was saying on the data side and the sort of rules and structures, if we're using approaches and benchmarks and sort of data that were set up for a fundamentally different system, they're definitely not going to be fit for purpose for what we're trying to do now. So I think, it really is, when we talk about this transformational change, it's not just changing, plugging in one generation asset for the other, but really thinking about what is that underlying piece there. And then I think also some of the market access ability. So making sure that, whether it's in a crown corporation and following, say, the example of the US with PURPA, where, you're really, any generator can come along and say, look, if I can generate power for less than the cost for the regulated utility to do so, then you have to be willing to take my power, because that's clearly going to be beneficial for electricity users. And then similarly on the market side, for a deregulated market like Alberta, looking at where are there market rules that just simply don't allow participation of certain resources. So, storage, for example, being treated like some sort of quasi-generator load is clearly a barrier to that participation. And then maybe just one other thing to mention that I think also is going to become more important is this concept of like the mid-transition. We talk a lot about sort of where we are today and where we want to get to in the future. But we are going to spend some, decades in some sort of mid-transition period that's really, in my mind, defined by having both, existing fossil heavy systems and zero carbon systems that exist at a scale that they start to each put sort of pressures on the other. And I think that that's another area that we need to start to better plan for. And maybe one example, just to make that a little bit more concrete, is, nowadays when we talk about the price, say, of electricity generated from a natural gas facility, we use some fixed lifetime of that project, or we look at the cost of that generation today. And I think it's increasingly important that we consider, the sort of what the world is going to look like in 10, 15 years from now. And if we're going to need to retire that resource early, or if it's going to, need to be paired with more expensive carbon capture and storage, that might change the economics of looking at a low emission option, say, solar plus storage, that might look more expensive today, but when you really consider over the sort of full lifetime and when we're planning for, that calculation becomes different.
Thanks, Sarah. So Pierre-Olivier, I wonder if you can answer this question in the context of this, your scoping paper talks about the value of greater coordination, integration, and we've actually got some comments going on in the chat about it right now. So just wondering if you can weigh in on, part of my question was, are we aligned to deliver on that? I think we know we're not when it comes to that greater east-west coordination, but to your mind, what would it take to get us closer there or even there?
Well, that's a huge question, and I don't have a specific answer. There are different avenues that we could follow. Hopefully, provinces would realize that they need each other to optimize their system, and we really truly need each other, both across Canada and in the US. There are huge opportunities. What needs to change is this, and that's been mentioned already, some central planning and governance bodies that would be there, not in the sense that they would tell there and then would dictate what to do, but they would provide an overview of what has to be done. In some ways, like in the EU, there's an association of transmission operator. They plan for the system and they define priority corridors for transmission, and they actually inject funds for these priority corridors for transmission. So that would be the kind of things we would need to basically say, we need transmission there and let's do it. And some people, Blake has mentioned, it's hard to build, but there's been interprovincial transmission being built in the past years. We think of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, between Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So new lines are being built. It is possible to build new lines if there is an agreement and coordination between different partners. So I think we need that. One thing that hasn't been mentioned so much is the importance of consumers and the relationship consumers have with electricity and prices. Tariffs have been designed for the past century. We pay by kilowatt hours. And as Madeleine mentioned, now, you know, the marginal cost won't matter so much. The fixed cost will be much more important. So what has to change is really how we pay for electricity. There will be, you know, there will have to pay for in a way like we pay for Netflix, and subscription-based payment for electricity with, you know, demand charges depending on the amount of kilowatts you use, and of course, you know, when you use it. So a mixture of demand charges and time of use payment will have to be implemented. And for that, we'll need to educate consumers, Canadian consumers, way more than what we've been doing in the past, because people are basically ignorant when it comes to, you know, what's the grid and what's electricity and what are the costs involved.
Can I just add to that, Jason, just to hammer it home? These are exactly the types of things. I'm running experiments with utilities right now. They prefer to call them pilots, I guess, where we're doing that exact thing. We're giving people these fixed rates, all you can eat consumption, Netflix style, but there's certain times, certain events where we say, hey, red flag day, you know, it's going to be expensive to use any power today, or you can't use it, or you lose some of your discount. It's going to be a little awkward at first because people are unfamiliar with it. So that's why we're doing these trials, to try to find what's the best way to make people comfortable with this. And ultimately, there's a lot of automation potential to really deal with this, because as you know, Madeleine and Pierre, we've all pointed out, the system is moving towards more and more fixed costs with periods of extreme value on flexibility. And so we want to reflect that all the way through to the consumer.
Thanks, Blake. So our next question is about intergovernmental coordination and collaboration. The Canadian Constitution provides provinces and territories with the right to manage their electricity sectors, yet decarbonization is a national priority. So in your mind, what role should the federal government take in advancing electricity system transformation to achieve net zero goals? So this one's first come, first served. Who'd like to start us off?
So I'll jump in right away and continue. I think the federal government has to step in and show leadership. And in a way, you know, in healthcare, at one point, the federal government said we'll need a universal healthcare system. And the federal government, you know, fought for that because it was needed. And we will need, but still, the federal government was cautious of, you know, letting provinces still manage their own healthcare system. So there were some federal guidance, federal money, but also independence and respect for the provincial powers. So I think the federal government will have in some ways to come in and say, we need the national standards in terms of power systems, and there'll be money, there will be transferred to the provinces, but they'll keep their powers, and that could be a way to make people integrate with some federal leadership, but still within the Canadian constitutions.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think, you know, we've seen the federal government step in a little bit with the backstop on carbon price and doing it in exactly this way that Pierre-Olivier is talking about, right? Where not stepping on the toes of the provinces too much for the provinces who already had carbon pricing schemes, but providing a backstop, right? And I think that was I think it sort of shows the clear role that the government has to play in mitigating carbon emissions. And I think the other place that the federal government again can step in is again on these interprovincial transmission lines. You know, we know that these are a part of the pathway towards decarbonization, especially in the Canadian context, where we have these hydro-rich provinces that conveniently neighbor provinces that have fantastic wind and solar resources, right? And so I think that the federal government, actually, Kristen van de Bezenbos from the University of Calgary just wrote a fantastic paper really making the legal argument for the federal government's role in this, and that it's really more of a policy question than it is a legal question. And I think that when it comes to transmission planning, I mean, what we know is that the piecemeal and reactive approach to transmission planning is always more expensive and results in less adaptable infrastructure. So really what we need is proactive plans that evaluate multiple benefits, not just production costs, but also outages and reliability, resiliency, environmental benefits, consumer, benefits for consumers, and also address long-term uncertainties. And what this all boils down to is jointly planning interregionally. And I think that the role, to my mind, the role of the federal government in that is really clear.
Maybe I can just jump on and add to that. I'm just vehemently agreeing with everything that Madeleine is saying there, and I think it's. I saw actually that Kristen put a question even in the chat about whether the barriers between provinces around interconnections are political, and I think that the answer is very much yes. You know, if you talk about technical challenges of integration, I mean, yes, it's there's work to do to build interties, but this is not a technical challenge. This is something that we know how to do, and certainly managing larger grid balancing areas brings up different challenges for a grid operator, but it also actually makes things a lot easier in other ways. So again, there it's not a technical challenge, but I do think that the narrative is a big piece around this, right? And this idea of who are winners and losers through those interconnections, and so those both pieces of, on the one hand, I think a better narrative and a better understanding really of who stands to gain from those interconnections, because I do think that, when I hear this conversation going on, from the perspective of what Alberta or Saskatchewan or other provinces have to lose by interconnecting with hydro provinces, it does seem to be that there's this bit of this myth that like, oh, well, if we're going to be importing hydropower into Alberta, then we're losing out because we're not getting to generate electricity, when in fact, the reverse is true. And if we look at, the power that we need to, or the generation that we need to add to our mix in order to meet the demand for more electricity in the future, the wind and solar in provinces like Alberta is the cheapest option on the energy cost to do so. And so it's a real opportunity actually for these provinces to build out that infrastructure, to get the, the jobs that go along with that, the landowner and municipal payments for royalties and the tax base. And that is really kind of not coming through. And I think a piece of that is the narrative, and the piece of that is, who stands to lose from that, and how, and what is the role of the government in basically saying, well, look, if we can make this transition at a similar cost, or even with cost savings, as I think, modeling is increasingly showing that if you have these interconnected systems, and if we are building out new generation, you can do that, then there's a question of, politically, how do you share those benefits so that you're able to move that conversation forwards? And I think that's a very important thing that we need to have.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just jump in to say that if Kristen can maybe aim to share her paper, let us know when it'd be available. I think some folks in the chat are interested. And I'll add to the plug by saying Lost in Transmission is an excellent title for a paper focused on that. Over to Blake.
Yeah, I was going to add to something Sara said, but then I reply to a comment here by Ken online. It's a misnomer here in Alberta. You talk to anybody about connecting, bigger integration with British Columbia, and they immediately think that Alberta is going to get flooded with cheap hydropower. Full disclosure, for 7 years, I worked at BC Hydro. I also worked here on the Alberta side in TransAlta, but my role at BC Hydro was on modeling and dispatching the hydro system. And I guarantee you, they're not interested in low value hours. All they are interested in is the peaks. So providing energy when it's valuable, which means when there's no other alternatives here in Alberta. And like Sara said, it provides an outlet for the better renewable resources here in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So it is about trade. It's not about one-way flow like a pipeline of liquid fuels we often think of as one-way flow. But to Ken's question here was, what legislation is required or what's needed from a federal government to affect the clean electricity transition? I must admit, maybe this is my personal bias and we might differ across the panel, but I think the federal government actually does need a soft touch when it comes to specific electricity regulation. I think the backstop's been pretty useful in terms of letting provinces, choose their own path. I can speak to the Alberta policy, and I'll say it's going to be very effective in decarbonizing electricity. I've got this paper coming out with Chris Bataille tomorrow, and we see by 2030, hydrogen displaces natural gas with these types of predicted carbon prices if they come to fruition. The federal government could use powers like they did with coal and dictate specific emission intensity, which would drive out gas. But that's going to be, in my view, quite an intrusion into provincial systems. I think the best role for the feds is to coordinate interconnectedness and to coordinate planning amongst regions. Even before we start talking about connecting and operating, dispatching together or imbalance markets, just planning at the, that sort of longer term level together in a more forthright fashion is pretty important and very valuable.
Thanks, Blake. So why don't we go to the Q&A from here? Anna's been collecting them and organizing them. So we'll ask her to put them to the group. We'll maybe aim to do kind of one panelist per question, just so we can get to as many as possible. But if you're just dying to get in there, of course, you know, we'll be happy to have you. So Anna, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Jason. So we've gotten a lot of great questions, many of which have already been answered by the panelists, either in the chat or through our discussion, which I think is great. So why don't we jump to a question from Kristen. She's asking if the panelists have a sense of the extent to which the barriers between provinces with respect to planning and interconnection are political. And if that's the case, can we change the narrative to bring the provinces to the table?
I think to some extent they're more institutional. Institutions that are not built in provinces to actually plan together. Quebec is not sitting with Ontario or New Brunswick to plan. And when actually politicians are sitting together, like they've done in the case of Quebec and New Brunswick, to actually merge the system, then it was a total disaster because there was no preparation. So when politicians are willing to do something, and it's been the case between Quebec and Ontario, when Philippe Couillard was a good friend with Premier Lynn, and there were agreements being made. So politicians can actually be more aligned than institutions, and they don't follow. So it's actually probably more difficult to change institutions than to change politicians, and then it's really institutional work that has to be done to align provinces.
Yeah, I'd say market structure matters a lot. So, Pierre-Olivier mentioned Saskatchewan and Manitoba building some connections. You have two vertically integrated systems who can bilaterally negotiate an old school trade exchange. Whereas if you talk about Alberta and British Columbia, we have a competitive, deregulated generation market here with prices, dealing with BC, which has no prices and vertically integrated, and a self-sufficiency requirement, which implies some sort of domestic subsidy. So we have these things that create an imbalance in terms of reciprocity that would need to be dealt with. On the political side, and maybe this isn't the right term, I'm not a political scientist, but I do see, and I see it here in Alberta, pressure from incumbents, that's sort of who stands to gain and who stands to lose. When we think about BC-Alberta exchange, well, who stands to gain? BC will gain from having another outlet for high value power. The benefits from trade. Alberta consumers will benefit because in a decarbonizing world, we have access to something cheaper than what we'd otherwise do. Alberta renewable developers stand to benefit. Who stands to lose? Alberta peaking facilities. These are the incumbents. They're the large generators. They have a lot more clout than consumers or renewable developers. And that has some political power.
Thanks, Blake. So why don't we go to the next question? If other panelists have more to add, feel free to be active in the chat. I see Sarah's already taking on some additional questions in there, so that's great. Over to Anna.
Sure, so we've got a couple of questions about recovering costs. So I'll lump them together. How can we socialize the cost of electricity infrastructure build out we need? Should it all accrue to ratepayers? And relatedly, how do we address stranded assets without making the delivered cost of electricity unaffordable for consumers?
I can jump in with a couple of thoughts here. I think the first one on the stranded assets, the first thing here, and maybe this is one area where Blake and I disagree a little bit, is, I think we need to stop building things that have a risk of being stranded in the near term. And that's where I do think that there, can be a useful role for a somewhat more heavy-handed set of regulations from the federal government that really encourages the development of, for example, new natural gas facilities not to happen, right? Because we see in Alberta that they are happening, and while this should be happening in a market way, and if and when those resources become stranded, it should be on the owners or the investors to bear that cost. The experience from the coal phase out shows us that that is not always the case politically, and so I do think that making sure that we're, at least if not through direct regulations, through very clear communication, that we are not going to enter into a gas phase out discussion in 10, 15 years from now with companies at the other side of the table saying there's no way we could have known that gas is going to be phased out, therefore we need to be compensated for our investment. I think that's a discussion to have now. On the socializing the cost side and where this sits, to me, there's sort of two pieces to that. one is that, it's not clear that this is going to actually be higher cost for the system as a whole, especially if we're able to build a more integrated system. And we're, electrifying a number of sources of energy use today. That can actually end up being a cheaper system to run overall, and the requirement of building out more transmission and distribution lines can get spread over a higher demand for electricity. That said, it certainly is going to have, distributional impacts, and it's not going to affect everybody equally. And I think that is very important role for the government at, both levels to think about that, and particularly as it comes down to really equity concerns as well too, and many of the things that we're thinking about doing around time of use rates or rates for electricity that vary during periods of high demand. I think we need to be very careful that we're thinking and sort of disconnecting the portion of electricity that's really, somehow required for a reasonable standard of living from some of the price signals that we might be trying to send to consumers, so that we don't create a system that's really denying some people access to limited amounts of electricity when they do need it. And that's a planning question, right? There are ways to address this, but I think it's an area that we really need to be thoughtful going in, because if we don't have those equity concerns front and center, there is a risk of shifting those costs onto a group that cannot afford them.
And maybe I'll just jump in there myself as well to note that one of the key findings of our net zero work that kind of flew under the radar a bit was that across all scenarios, all pathways to net zero, the cost of energy services, so including fuel, electricity, all types of energy, and including the equipment that those fuels power, so cars and furnaces and the like, the cost of that across the income distribution were going down over time. And that's quite a powerful finding. And I think, don't want to, gloss over what is going on under the surface here. There's certain types of households that will face challenges that it's not going to play out equally across regions, but just to sort of back up that story, that we should be careful assuming that this is going to be a higher cost system. Certainly there's transition costs and some challenges to think of, but an important higher level finding there. Back to Anna.
Sure, thanks, Jason. So here's one for Madeleine. How do you see energy system models playing a role in helping our policymakers navigate the many challenging topics discussed today?
Yeah, so I think one follows on from exactly this conversation or these points that Sarah and Jason were just raising, which is, I think when it comes to looking at the cost as a whole, there's sort of one story. But then as we get into the nuances there, there's multiple benefits and multiple costs across different systems, across different jurisdictions. And I think that, modeling can play a really powerful role in getting specific about those numbers. So again, if we just come back to transmission as an example, not to say it's the only thing that matters, but just as an example, because that's such a part of the conversation that we're having in general in Canada right now. We know that there's multiple benefits from transmission costs or from transmission expansion, everything from reducing outages, environmental benefits, reducing transmission losses, reducing congestion, having a more optimal dispatch, potentially avoided costs in generation infrastructure, resilience, so on and so forth, right? And so models can be tools to quantify that and see exactly, okay, so who is benefiting from that reduced congestion, for example? Who is, what is the number? What is that number? And where is that number being allocated to which stakeholders? And then remunerating where appropriate, distributing benefits and costs where appropriate, like that. I think that it's really in those details when it comes to, obviously the big picture as well, but really when it comes to those specifics and overcoming. And so it's helpful for me as a modeler to be part of these conversations, just, Sarah's framing around sort of winners and losers and this sort of narrative around, okay, well, Alberta's perspective on if there's an interprovincial transmission line with BC, for example. As a modeler, I take that and think, okay, well, that's a number that we can get out of our models, right? We can actually quantify that with uncertainty and, there's assumptions and all of the rest of it, but we can actually quantify that. And if we can get that number and frame it in this way of, frame it for a Alberta politician or Alberta consumer who's having a certain reaction, a certain assumption around what that intertie is going to be for their costs, well, then I think that that's a helpful contribution potentially to the conversation.
Great, thanks, Madeleine. Here's one for everyone. Could the panelists comment on the clean electricity standard that the federal Liberals campaigned on in the last election? Could this regulatory backstop overcome market and political barriers by 2035?
I can. This is what I meant by a bit of heavy-handedness, if they want to. So, clean electricity standard, as Canada envisions it, and that word is a bit opaque. It means pretty much whatever you want it to mean these days in the United States. But really, it's a facility-specific emission intensity is the understanding that I have of what Canada is thinking about. So similar to what we have for, say, coal plants. Thou must not emit greater than X emission intensity from any facility. So they could do that. They would have the rights to do that under legislation, under SEPA, I believe it is. It would specify the types of facilities that are acceptable. And so what the challenge is, it would remove a lot of flexibility at a portfolio level. My view on emissions from, say, natural gas is that we actually want to maintain capacity in a natural gas system for a while here in many provinces, but we just want to use their generation as least as possible because that's where the emissions come from. But the capacity is extremely valuable. Now, eventually, and as I said, this paper coming out, I think it'll be very quickly replaced by clean fuels like hydrogen. And so we'll get to a point where we're less concerned about the generation coming out of it. But if we restrict the inability to use any of that capacity, it's going to be a legitimately hard challenge if we're talking about 2030 or 2035. And I am certainly not someone who's anyway trying to delay decarbonizing electricity, but I just see a real challenge there for places like Alberta and Saskatchewan to altogether remove any emitting natural gas from their system in that time frame.
Yeah, I think those, it's clear that if you do come in with regulations, they need to be very well designed and very thoughtful around what you're trying to achieve, right? And I think I agree with Blake's point of, running a natural gas facility for a very short period of time to contribute to capacity in a week of need in Alberta doesn't have a big emissions impact. And so I think that those kinds of regulations, I do think that they have a place, as I said, because I think that we're seeing that the pricing alone isn't causing people to stop building these facilities. So I think that arguably there is a role for that regulation, but I think that regulation needs to be smart in its design and not just be a blanket, no natural gas ever, or, only a certain amount from each facility, but actually somehow on this aggregate level that allows for that flexibility within the overall signal that you're trying to send.
Great, thanks. So we have a question about the role of distributed energy resources versus more centralized ones. And the question is whether the development of DERs offers options for bypassing incumbents and institutional structures which seem deeply challenged to respond to the challenge of decarbonization. Any thoughts on DERs?
I think they'll play a big role, but in a way they are complementary to what's being there. So they will offer more flexibility for consumers, but and ideally the distribution network would be managed in a way where it's a platform for energy trading, so that DR with utility scale generators would basically access different markets through the transmission and distribution networks, and there would be even more decoupling between the different business sectors. So DR would basically compete with generators, traditional generators, and that's what that's what I think is the way forward. But there'll be still a need for utility scale generation, and there'll be a need for decentralized generation, and what has to be ensured is really access to the network and the market, and this is what we don't have in most provinces, especially the regulated provinces.
Thanks, Pierre-Olivier. We've got a labor force question. So given that the system is going to need to grow to meet net zero goals, have any of you thought about how we can build out the necessary labor market to meet those needs?
This is an opportunity for Sarah to plug the program she's director of.
Thanks, Blake. I think there's huge workforce needs, obviously, in sort of retraining and reskilling of workers. And so, of course, there's a role for universities. So as Blake mentioned, I direct the Sustainable Energy Development Master's Program at the University of Calgary. I know that we have a great network within NATE and SATE of also programs to train people to become installers of renewable energy and others. But I think, again, yeah, this is an area where, I think one of the key things is really looking for adjacent competencies that, within a given region, say Alberta, that the workforce has that can be applied. And so sometimes that is, really within a similar kind of sector. And obviously carbon capture and storage is one that's, gotten a lot of attention because it is so close. But looking also deeper at where the competencies lay. And so, Alberta's experience managing large projects, financing and large capital project management, how does that apply to the kind of technologies and products that the world is going to need going forwards? I think is an important part of this, because if we restrict ourselves really to just, what's the next thing closest to the energy sector, I don't think that we're going to be in the right place for the transition overall.
And maybe I'll just add that there's a group called Electricity Human Resources Canada that's done some really good work on these questions, including a recent report. So I'll drop a link to their site and that report in the chat in a moment.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. So here's one asking if the panelists can comment on the Ontario government's intent to build new gas plants to compensate for nuclear plants going offline.
I think that's a great illustration of the lack of interprovincial planning, and I'm not saying that Quebec or Manitoba would have been the answer to that, but I'm pretty sure there could have been answers preventing the construction of new natural gas power plants in Ontario. But because of the lack of planning, and because of the vested interest of some players in Ontario, then that was the solution chosen. So it's a sad reality that we keep making bad choices because of the lack of interprovincial coordination.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to clean, firm power is challenging. And, new incremental large hydro, which Canada's benefited from the past in terms of the systems we have now, citing those are challenging. And so limiting our option set by not expanding our transmission is really going to increase costs, and it's going to mean natural gas stays on our system longer than it would otherwise. So that's sort of why many of us are passionate about that topic. It's simply because it's a nice piece of the tool set. It's a really valuable one to help decarbonize, especially given the heterogeneity we have across provinces in Canada.
But I do want to stress there's still a lot that we can do even today, though, right? Because I think we certainly are going to need to be thinking more about firm power as we get into that, 80 to 90% decarbonization or above 50, whatever it is within, say, the grids like Alberta and Saskatchewan. But the next, incremental need for power, I think it's clear we actually can meet with a mix of renewables plus storage plus demand response today. Now, that's easier said than done from a technical versus institutional perspective and actually making that happen. But on the technical side, those next steps in decarbonization are actually not as hard as the ones that we will face later on. And so I think it's also important that we, focus on getting those next ones right now while we're planning for the future ones, but not to let, not here in this conversation, but in other places, not to let that later challenge sort of color and make it appear that the next steps that we have to take are more difficult than they really are.
Thanks all. I think we've run out of time. There were so many great questions and unfortunately we didn't get to all of them, but I'll pass it back to Jason for some final remarks.
Thanks, Anna. I've just dropped those links in just now that I mentioned. So we will have to wrap here in the interest of time. Thanks everybody for attending today. I'd encourage you to visit climatechoices.ca/electricity to get access to these 4 scoping papers. Quite soon, we'll have a video recording of this webinar posted if you wanted to share that or rewatch any parts of it. And more to come there at that page in the coming months, if somebody can kind of drop that link in there, chat one more time. We'll also be sure to keep you in the loop as our larger electricity project here at the Climate Institute evolves. So with that being said, thank you all for joining. Thanks to our panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us, and wishing you all a great day. Thanks.